On January 25, 1972, Shirley Chisholm announced her presidential campaign in Brooklyn, New York. She broke the barrier of the idea that African American women were incapable of political involvement by running for president as the first African American and the first Democratic woman to do so. Her campaign revolved around advocacy for African Americans and inner-city residents living in poverty. Although she did not receive the Democratic bid, Chisholm's campaign opened the door for future female and African American political leaders. Shirley Chisholm became involved in New York politics in the 1960s during a time of political and social turmoil. In the history of America to 1968, only 31 African American men and 75 women of any race had been elected to serve in Congress. African Americans faced discrimination in education and politics, and did not have the right to lead a free life. Efforts such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed poll taxes and literacy tests that blocked African Americans from voting, attempted to end the barrier of discrimination in America. Although acts such as this were passed, segregation in the United States persisted. Ongoing segregation led many African Americans to push for new leadership in Congress. During this time, women also faced discrimination that blocked them from participating in politics. For example, in 1960, the Equal Rights Amendment, which proposed equal legal rights for all sexes, was rejected by the Democratic Party. Women were frustrated at this decision because most didn't have access to high-paying jobs, equal education, and were forced to lead lives at the discretion of men, all of which dissuaded women from careers in politics. Groups such as the National Organization for Women, which Shirley Chisholm co-founded in 1966, formed to advocate for the rights of women. Organizations like these spotlighted the barriers put in place by a male-dominated society. Shirley Chisholm grew up during the Great Depression in the low-income neighborhood of Bedford-Stuyvesant in New York City. Employment opportunities for African American women were slim during the 1950s, but she was able to find a job as the director of a nursery. From the perspectives she gained from this job, Chisholm was inspired to join local political groups to push for equal education in her neighborhood. After 10 years of community organizing, Chisholm decided to run for state legislature. She handily won the election and immediately used her new political power to advocate for more representation of African Americans and closing the gender gap in politics. Because she experienced the oppression of inner-city minorities firsthand, Chisholm thought she could best represent her district's needs at a national level. In 1968, Chisholm decided to expand her advocacy by running for the United States House of Representatives. She won this election, becoming the first African American woman in the House. Despite her victory, many of her ideas were pushed aside by fellow congressmen. They assigned her to the Committee of Agriculture, an area in which she had no experience. Chisholm's reception by the other members of Congress in Washington made her realize that she had to advance social change, not just in New York, but nationwide.
I stand before you today as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States of America.
Shirley Chisholm announced her presidential campaign in front of supporters in Bedford-Stuyvesant in January of 1972. By running for president, she broke the barrier of the past precedent that African American women were unfit to hold office.
I think Shirley Chisholm ran for president because she felt like there was nobody who was speaking to the issues that were really important to her. She suffered both racism and sexism, but sexism was a bigger limiting factor, that people were much more likely to dismiss her or not take her seriously because she was a woman rather than the fact that she was an African American.
Her campaign advocated for abortion rights, funding for urban communities, and access to education for all. Chisholm's platform was unique because she actively engaged with voters instead of relying on sponsors, following her slogan, Unbought and Unbossed. In the beginning of her presidential run, most of the press, especially broadcasting agencies, didn't take her seriously and rarely wrote or televised about her campaign. Chisholm and her main competitor, George McGovern, a Democratic senator from South Dakota, had many of the same values, but the public favored McGovern because, as a white man, they believed he was more likely to win against incumbent President Richard Nixon. In her own district, Chisholm's grassroots campaign strategy gained her the support of many women.
What's wrong with my running for president of this country? After all, for 15 years, I have been the ghostwriter for a lot of them.
As Chisholm's nationwide campaign grew, she showed America that an African American woman could impact politics. Despite Chisholm's effort and outreach, her presidential run came to an end at the 1972 Democratic National Convention. Shirley Chisholm struggled to gain the support of the delegates from the Congressional Black Caucus, a group she had co-founded to further the rights of African Americans. They were unwilling to back her because the caucus believed that an African American man would be more successful than a woman in a presidential campaign, leaving her in fourth place by the end of the convention. Chisholm ended her presidential campaign, but had shown America that it was possible for women and African Americans to have a voice in politics. After dropping out of the race for Democratic nominee, Shirley Chisholm brought the values from her campaign into her work in Congress. In 1977, she co-founded the Congressional Women's Caucus, which presented women's rights conversations to the House floor. Throughout her entire time in Congress, she sponsored 64 bills individually, most advocating for civil rights and equal education opportunities. When Chisholm retired from Congress in 1983, she had shown that all people can be leaders in politics, regardless of race or gender. Since Shirley Chisholm's presidential campaign, 46 Black women have served and advocated in Congress. Chisholm's campaign taught women to not wait their turn anymore and have confidence in their ideas. It also showed all minorities that the American dream shouldn't be designed for just white men. Directly following her run, 3 more Black women were elected to Congress in 1973. Representative Barbara Lee began her career in politics as a campaigner for Chisholm's presidential run and is still an advocate for the values that Shirley Chisholm fought for in her campaign. In the 2018 election, many African American women candidates cited Shirley Chisholm as a political leader who inspired them to run for office.
Shirley Chisholm was a woman who inspired other women. She was a woman who had courage.
The fight for civil rights and education that was the cornerstone of Shirley Chisholm's campaign continues to be a pressing issue in today's society. Her outspoken advocacy was disregarded during her time, but still reflects the injustices of modern America.
I think Shirley Chisholm will go down in history as the one who really broke that barrier that said to women, wait your turn.
Shirley Chisholm emerged during a time of unequal access to politics and education for African Americans and women. She quickly rose from local politics to the U.S. Congress on the platform of advocating for the rights of inner-city residents. Her strong belief in social justice for all inspired her to run for president in 1972. Through grassroots campaigning, she gained the support of many women, but was unable to sway the opinions of enough male voters. Despite this loss, her presidential campaign, the bills she passed, and the speeches she made showed that it was possible for minorities to have an independent voice in politics. Shirley Chisholm broke the barrier of the systematic exclusion of African American women from politics, showing that the oppressed can make a change in America.
Oh, Shirley.